Welcome back to Nonfiction for Life, the podcast with authors who write compelling true stories and books with great ideas for living well. I'm your host, Janet Perry. Today, we'll be talking to Richard Glaubman, co-author of Life is So Good, One Man's Extraordinary Journey Through the 20th Century and How He Learned to Read at age 98. It's not a new book, but it's one that's worthy of our time, especially during this Thanksgiving season, when we feel especially inclined to focus on gratitude. But first, we want to thank you for your interactions after last week's podcast with Erica Komisar, author of Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters. We enjoyed reading your comments, both on our website and on our social media sites. And now I'm pleased to introduce our author today, Richard Glaubman. He's a bit of an accidental author. He graduated from UC Berkeley, and his only formal writing class was the required freshman English 101 that he didn't complete until his last quarter of his senior year. The day after graduation, he went to collect his final paper, and he found that he'd received an A. And his professor said, "You actually have some talent. What are you going to do now that you're finished with school?" Well, having graduated with no plan in mind, Glaubman surprised himself when he responded, "I'm going to be a writer." It took a while for him to get there. He held numerous jobs in restaurants, he fished commercially in Alaska, he planted trees in British Columbia, Canada, and he worked in the construction industry. He entered his career as a teacher eventually and taught for 32 years, and he's now retired. But along the way, he felt compelled to write the story of George Dawson, the man who learned to read at age 98. This 2-year collaboration turned Richard Glaubman into the writer he once predicted he'd become. And today we'll hear how two men from very different backgrounds became not only co-authors, but dear friends. We'd like to welcome Richard Glaubman. Welcome to the program, Richard. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
At one time, lots of people knew about George Dawson because the papers picked up his story, and you were among those people who read the story. So tell us how you came across this amazing story and how it led you to Mr. Dawson.
Right. Yeah, I still remember vividly the article. It was by Larry Bingham in the Dallas Morning News. It was actually in our Seattle Times Sunday paper, and it was a large feature article about a man, George Dawson, that was having his 100th birthday party at the time. And actually, my wife passed that article to me. It was a Sunday morning. Still remember, I'm sitting at the same kitchen table, and she passed this paper over to me and says, "You need to see this article. It would be a good one to take down to school." And for us, in our household, fresh scones and Sunday paper is our family tradition on Sundays. And after pouring myself a cup of coffee, I looked at a photograph that it just seemed like it came from another world almost. It was a photo of a proud man. It was short. It was an older black man standing on the porch of an old wood frame house. It spoke volumes, but it carried with it an air of mystery. That was in the winter of 1898. I'm thinking of George Dawson. It was in the winter of 1998, and George Dawson was 100 years old. The article described how he was reading birthday cards at the school he went to, and that he had learned to read after going to school for the very first day in his life at the age of 98. And it just struck me as, how could someone learn to read at that point? How could someone have the courage to just start school at that age? When my view of age at that time was that if someone was living, how they wouldn't have much vitality or presence of mind either. And so it just was astounding to me that he could, after 3 years of schooling, be reading at a 5th grade level. I was teaching 4th grade at the time. I taught 1st grade, the typical age when you're teaching kids to read, and kids didn't pick up 5 years of reading in 3 years, let alone the age problem, or that I saw as an age problem of trying to have cognitive development at a later age. So I took it down to school, and my kids were really, I was fourth grade that I was teaching at the time. My kids were fascinated with the article, and I ended up calling George Dawson. My students had questions. Their questions were great. They wondered, does he go out to recess like we do? Does he sit in, I know, it's like I love their question. Does he sit in a chair? And by that they meant those low chairs that we all might remember when we were in third and fourth grade. Does he sit in a chair and a desk like we have? And those were their important questions. So I called with their questions, and I just had questions too, but I just didn't know what to say almost. And we just chatted briefly. And the end of the conversation, his teacher, Carl Henry, very politely said, as people in the South can be and are very polite, he said, when you're down this way sometime, stop in and we can talk some more. And I understood that was just a polite way to end a conversation.
Well, when you did go meet him, you eventually, and when you met him, he was still enrolled in school. So how did that, obviously he hadn't had that opportunity because he hadn't learned to read. How did that opportunity finally open up to him at 98 years old?
I went down about 3 weeks later and knocked on their classroom door, following up on that end of the conversation where Carl Henry said to me, stop on by when you're down this way. Well, I was down that way because I flew down to see them, and I knocked on the classroom door. And I don't know who was more surprised at that time, if it was them or me, but they were very gracious. And I came in, and I had some of those same questions as, how did this happen in the first place? How did you start school suddenly at 98? And what happened was a young man was going around the neighborhood passing out flyers for an adult education class, and the school that George Dawson's children had gone to had been closed as a public school and was now open for adult education and community groups and so on. But it was about 4 blocks from the house. It was the same school they'd always used. And he looked at the flyer, but of course he had to say, what does it say? And Michael, I think it was Michael Lightfoot was his name, said it's a class to teach reading. And George Dawson says, well, I've never been to school. And he says, oh, that's fine. And he says, when does it start? He says, oh, these classes are always all going on now. He says, well, just give me a minute. Let me grab my coat and my hat. And they walked on over. And this is the story I got, and I've heard it from many other people, a few other people too. And what struck me thinking about it later is if George Dawson hadn't been home, he would have found a flyer on his door about an education class to teach reading, and he wouldn't have known what it said, and he would have thrown it out, likely. But as he was home, the young man was able to read the flyer to him, and as they say, the rest is history. But so they got to school, and listening to Carl Henry tell this story, and I've heard it more than once, it's great. They got to school, and Carl Henry asked, well, have you ever been to school before? He goes, never. Do you know your letters? No, except for the letter X. That was how he signed his name. Mm-hmm. And Carl Henry's going, oh my gosh. And how old are you? I'm 98. He goes, well, have a seat. And they became the best and closest of friends over time. And it was a very interesting, powerful student-teacher relationship. As Carl Henry would often say, he was the student and George Dawson was the teacher.
He had a lot to teach at that point, a lot of life's wisdom. In fact, unlike many centenarians, his story spans not 2 but 3 centuries because of when his birthday is. And in the book you say, Mr. Dawson was a walking history book of the 20th century. It's a history that's often ignored and rarely recorded. I heard of a life that started with no expectations other than just plain survival. So at first you showed up in Texas, you felt compelled to go meet him, and then you felt a little ridiculous for showing up. but you have this gem of a story. But still, you were questioning your intentions and abilities. And then you wrote a book. So what happened in between there? What was the turning point that made you determined to stick with this behemoth project?
Well, I think looking back, events came together, and I didn't have any choice. It's something I had to do almost, but I didn't see that at the time. I think there's a saying that goes, there's a time for everyone to tell their story, and along with that, there's a time for everyone to listen. And I think we matched up together that way, and that's was maybe initially the only thing we had in common, that we both had a compelling need. He had the need; it was time for him to tell a story, and I needed to hear some stories. My father had died a year earlier, and the day I had read George Dawson's article, the article about George Dawson, about 3 weeks beforehand, and before the anniversary of my father's death, and filed it away. And then when it came down to it, I remember still I was cutting the lawn. It was a warm, one of those thaws we get in February here, and I was cutting the grass, and I just shut off the lawnmower and sat on the porch steps and thought about it, and went back in and called. And that's when I made the phone call to him, and that's what things in motion. I didn't realize my father had died, and I missed the stories that wished I had asked him, or that I could have heard.
So there was one point where you were interviewing Mr. Dawson and you realized that you were asking the wrong questions. And I wondered if you could share that moment with our listeners and describe how you pivoted, what you did going forward from there.
Yeah, the process of getting to there was a long journey. It took about 6 months to sort of organize my thoughts of how I was going to do the book. And I started with a children's book about a man who learned how to read, which I thought was an admirable achievement. But the more we got, that didn't take long. It's a picture book with some text. It didn't take long for me to write it. And I realized there's just so much more to his life as he kept telling me stories after story. And so I realized at one point, he's had such a life of hardship, and I had grown quite fond of him. And there had been a series of visits, and I've been living at his house while I would visit for about a week to 10 days at a time. And I just wanted to give him a chance to get his revenge, so to speak, because he'd never had a voice. And there was a moment when I asked, he had spent a couple years of his childhood, I think about age 10 to 12, living on a neighboring farm, working for a white family for a few dollars a month, which saved his family one less mouth to feed, and gave them a few dollars, literally a few dollars, maybe it was $5 or $6 a month, to help them get by. And I just thought, what an injustice. He lost his childhood. It was just, because I had children of my own that were not much older than that age at the time. I thought, how terrible is that? And so I said, what would you do today if you could talk to the Coles, if you could see the Cole family, if you could see Mr. Cole right now, what would you do? And he said, son, he called everybody son that was younger than him. So that was almost everybody. He said, son, I'd give Mr. Cole such a big hug and say, thank you. There were two thoughts. One was very selfish of me. There goes my manuscript, 6 months. I've probably got, I don't know, close to 100 pages, and I knew I got it all wrong. I said, you'd what? But the other part was, what are you saying? And he said, I'd thank him for teaching me how to work, how to be proud of what I do, how to be on time, how to be helpful to people. And he says, that has carried me through life ever since. And I go, oh, okay, that makes sense. But the lack of judgment that he chose to have, it had to be a choice almost, or if not conscious, and as unconscious choice to look at the best side of everything, was a powerful challenge to me. And I had to sort of regroup and restart. As we kept sharing stories, I started to understand it a little better.
He really was so grateful for the life he had, and he had literally nothing in terms of physical comforts or wealth, and I think that was one of the things that did surprise you and is just so interesting to read about. He worked really hard, and he didn't even seem to really care or notice that he was poor. In fact, he said about his family, we owned almost nothing, so he knew that. And then he says, but we had each other, and nobody told us we were poor. I never felt lonely, so his wealth seemed to lie in relationships. That continued clear through to the end of his life. Can you give us maybe a little more color of what that kind of lifestyle looked like for George Dawson?
Sure. Now remember, I only knew him in the later part of his life. But I did meet his family and became, his children were adult children, were adults by then, of course, and they were actually a bit older than me. But I became close friends with his son, George Jr., and who would be there almost every day. And when I was there, he'd come and visit both of us, and he would just come and check in on his father. And I saw such a warm relationship. But what happened in his later years, when he went to school, he became a mentor for all the other students who ranged in age from their 20s to their maybe 60s. And he's in his 90s and then cleared the bar and became 100. He became an example to them of what they could do, what one could do. And it was just a beautiful thing to watch, the community that he was part of. But I'm aware that talking to friends and neighbors, that was always the case.
At the very end of his book, he still lives this very Spartan lifestyle. And he says, besides groceries, he says, I just keep it simple. Besides groceries, I don't go shopping. I don't need more clothes. He says he has a tie for church and a few pairs of pants and a suit. And what a contrast to the kind of lifestyles that most of us lead in this country now. He just didn't seem to notice or care. And then you had kind of a funny conversation about stocks. Can you just maybe summarize that conversation that you had about investing?
What I would try to do during my visits is bring books down, because I realized at one point that he was as intrigued by my life as I was with his. Now that he'd learned to read, he would read the newspapers, but he didn't know what books to look at. And so we would talk about different books. And so I would come home and then fill a suitcase up before my next trip. It seemed like I filled half my suitcase was with books I'd bring down. I'd go to the library and get different books, sometimes about art, sometimes just about history. And I remember bringing a few books about investing, because I had the same thoughts that you were just talking about, is this man is happy living with nothing. So I brought a few of those books down that, frankly, I wasn't familiar with either, but that I checked out. And we were looking at the idea of investing. And I asked him about stocks, and he had a very strong accent. He had a deep Southern drawl, and he thought I had a funny accent. Well, the same was true in my direction too. Not funny accent, but it was hard for me at first. And he didn't understand. I had a hard time understanding him initially, and then it turned out that he had the same problem. So I kept saying, well, what do you think about stocks? Or he was saying when he had extra money, he would buy stocks. I thought he was saying stocks, and that just really surprised me. And after I asked about 4 times, it turned out he was saying socks. So a little extra money, buy a pair of socks to put in the drawer for the days when you have that extra money. Something sensible.
I'm glad you brought up those books. He contrasted your learning with his. He said that you'd read a lot of books, but you didn't even know how to slaughter a hog. So
That's
in
right.
what ways did the two of you come to appreciate each other's learning?
I remember one conversation sitting in the living room with, I think, George Jr. and George Jr.'s wife, Sally, were there. And I think Carl Henry was there. We were just sitting in this little living room, and we got to talking, and they were talking about the old days. The old days being when they were growing up, and we were all growing up. And they were talking about picking cotton, because everybody picked cotton during your elementary, high school years, back in those days in the South. The people of color did. And I said, oh. And I tried to get them to explain that. And they just looked at me, and I said, well, I've never picked cotton. And they just looked at me like I was from Mars. Growing up Jewish in the suburbs, no, we didn't pick cotton in the north. They didn't grow cotton either, for that matter. But it was just like our worlds were so different that it was really interesting, I think, to talk to each other.
Another thing that happened is you brought kind of history to him. And at the beginning, the way you've structured the book is at the beginning of each chapter rather, you include a little something from history. And at the beginning of one chapter, you have a snippet of news from a Lifetime book talking about the anti-evolution feelings that ran hot in Tennessee, leading to the Scopes trial. And this trial became known to many as the trial of the century. When you asked Mr. Dawson what he remembered about it, we kind of learned what it meant to be both illiterate and black. So tell us his response and what insight that gave you into his history.
Well, yeah, I do remember I remember sitting at the kitchen table with him at his house, and opened up the book, and it showed pictures, I think, of the lawyers in the courtroom. And I asked about that trial because I said, this was, you were alive then, and what did you think? Because it was really famous. I knew of it. And he says, I don't know anything about it. I said, it was huge. Everybody did this. No, all the white people did, maybe. He says, we were too busy trying to make a living. We didn't worry about things like that. I go, it was it was very humbling, actually. And it made me realize that his story, it was a parallel history. And the story of people, other working men and women, as he said, he represented them. And that became the reason for the book, in the version that's in. As I said, the original intent was a children's book, but the book as it came to fruition, I remember him saying, suddenly when we looked in the old newspapers about his hometown, he saw nothing of the people he knew because they didn't record history in their archives of black people because it was almost like they didn't exist. And he said, this is my answer why I'm still alive. I need to tell my story. And my story, he recognized, represented all the other working men and women and people of color whose history was rarely recorded.
Well, he does cover a lot of ground telling stories over a century-long life. He swore that he never forgot anything. He saw some good and some bad. He saw the KKK in action, as well as having much sweeter times playing baseball with his brother Johnny. They were very, very good at baseball because they were so strong from having worked so hard. Just thinking back on all the stories he did tell you, what's one of the stories that surprised you the most?
When he was ready to go, or he wanted to go with his father into town, and he'd been invited to go into town, and they were getting ready to go, and he was supposed to get the mule ready, and the mule was stubborn, and he threw a rock to hit it on the flank and get it moving, and it was way off and hit it in the eye, and caused that mule to go blind in one eye and caused a lot of pain. And he just felt terrible. He was probably 15 years old or something, then is what I recall. And and he was scared to tell his father, but his father just said, you need to deal with it. It's between you and Blue. That was the name of the mule. And I thought the wisdom that his father showed, and his mother too, is as parents, because they were illiterate and they never got the chance to learn. George Dawson's turn to learn to read came very late in life, but they never even had that chance. But the wisdom they showed in raising their children, in the common sense and in the moral upbringing they gave him was just amazing to me. And I realized how powerful it was in the context of the world they lived in. They lived at a time when they themselves didn't have electricity. They had no communication with the outside world. They lived on a farm out of town, and they couldn't read a newspaper if they saw it. And newspapers would be the news of the world. And they didn't even have that. So the influence they had as parents had to be much bigger than the influence that we as parents would have now today, because our children have so much other information coming into them from the general world. They did have total control over the effect of their thoughts on their expressing their thoughts to their children. And I thought they just did a remarkable job in seeming to know when to step back and when to say, this is what's right and wrong.
You know, if I recall correctly, when you asked him, what is the one, do you have any regrets? That's the story he told. So that really carried with him his whole life, quite literally. What do you think the one story he would have wanted everyone to hear would be?
Well, I think he was proud of his own story. In the big picture, when he would say to kids, young people, you're never too old and it's never too late. Because he was very proud of what he'd accomplished in the latter part of his life, when people just sort of looked at him as an old man who was too late to do anything.
After you published the book, the two of you went on a book tour, traveling by plane, his first time by plane, to New York, Chicago, Seattle. And you say it was as if he entered the 20th century all at once. And as his life was changing dramatically by this new experience, you realized that your life had also changed, and you decided to write a second book, which you call More Than a Book, A Story of Friendship. You felt changed not so much by publishing the book, but by becoming friends with Mr. Dawson. So tell us about Mr. Dawson and the long-term effect he's had on you. Of course, he passed away soon after you met him, but what still lives on in you as a result of knowing him?
Well, I think realizing, like we've talked a little bit about how he had so little in life, almost nothing it seemed like, but he he was happy in life. He led a successful life because he felt good about. And to realize it's not about what we accumulate, but how we treat other people, what positive effect we can have. And within that, there's a lot of choice. I mean, we don't always get everything we strive for or want, but we can choose what we're looking for, number one, and we can choose what we do. We have a lot of choice, and we have a choice. It's almost a choice whether to be happy or not. Because if this man could be happy with almost nothing, then what do the rest of us need? Or why do we need more than he does?
Which brings us back to the title of your book, Life is So Good. Where did he learn to feel that way, or to say that mantra?
Whenever I'd asked, have you seen any violence in your life? He'd go, no, everything's been fine. Okay. Yeah, and I asked other people, I go, a black man growing up, in the last century, no, there's things he's not going to talk to everybody or talk to you about, and that's okay. And I go, okay, that's okay. But remember one point, and I think it was, well, I do remember I was heading out for the airport, and he was so self-sufficient that I was surprised when he said, "You have to go." Yeah, I have a plane ticket and we need to head back. And he almost had tears in his eyes. He goes, "Well, okay, I'll be lonely." And I was just stunned, but I go, "Well, I've got to go. And, I have appointments and this and that." And I headed off and it was okay. And then I started going to the airport and I turned around and I came back. And by then it was raining, it was dark, and I'm knocking on the door, and he pounded, and he wouldn't answer, and so I'm pounding on the door. I thought he couldn't hear me. I thought he was back in the kitchen. He comes to the door with a baseball bat in his hand, thinking I'm about to break in. But once we got in and I got dried off, it was one of those torrential downpours you can get there. We started talking. It was well past, and we didn't usually stay up that late, either of us, but it was past midnight. And then all of a sudden he started talking about George, or his father's, who was the same name, and when they saw a lynching, when George Dawson was a young boy. And I just still remember sitting on the couch and how still the air was in the living room. And he started talking, and he had tears in his eyes, and I didn't know what to say. In fact, I didn't say a word. And he told me the story of Pete Spillman and how he watched him being lynched, he and his father both. And it was just so powerful. And at the same time, his father later said to him, life is good as it is. Life is so good. You get what you can out of it. You can't judge anybody else. We have no right as human beings to judge other people. And that's a lesson that George Dawson, as a young boy, took to heart.
Well, I'm sure glad you had the good sense to go back in the rain and capture that amazing story and that gem of wisdom. Thank you so much for spending time with us today and giving us some wonderful perspective through your book.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
You've been listening to author Richard Glaubman. Richard helped give voice to the story of George Dawson in his book, Life is So Good, One Man's Extraordinary Journey Through the 20th Century and How He Learned to Read at age 98. We hope you'll join us next week again when we talk to Dr. Kevin Lehman, author of the Birth Order book. We think you'll have some fun as you learn more about how your birth order affects you all throughout life, including at those family gatherings now as you're an adult. As always, we hope that we're helping you save time as we curate books that are insightful, inspiring, and uplifting. I'm your host, Janet Perry, and this has been another episode of the Nonfiction for Life podcast. Remember, at Nonfiction for Life, we believe there's something for everyone. We'll talk to you next time.